4,000 years of recorded history with elephants, thousands of trained working animals across Asia, and not a single one of them is domesticated, not genetically, not in any sense that matters biologically. Here's what the genome data actually says. The standard assumption was straightforward. The Indus Valley civilization around 4,500 years ago began keeping elephants. Seals from that era show their outlines. Later texts from South and Southeast Asia describe detailed systems for training, feeding, and managing captive elephants. Given that this civilization built planned cities with drainage systems and standardized weights, the reasonable inference was that they also established a breeding population, the same way humans did with cattle, horses, goats, and dogs. That inference turned out to be wrong, and genome sequencing is what proved it. Researchers sequenced DNA from working elephants in timber camps, primarily in Myanmar, and compared those genomes to wild elephant populations in the surrounding forests. If domestication had occurred, the signal would be unmistakable. Reduced genetic diversity, a distinct population cluster separated from wild herds, the kind of bottleneck you see clearly in the genomes of dogs relative to wolves or cattle relative to aurochs. None of that showed up. Captive elephants were statistically indistinguishable from wild populations in the same region. No bottleneck, no reduced heterozygosity, no accumulated signature of generations of controlled breeding. Genetically, there is no such thing as a domestic elephant lineage. Every working elephant, whether in a logging operation, a temple, or a tourist camp, carries the full genetic profile of a wild animal because that is exactly what it is. So why did domestication never happen? Despite 4 millennia of close contact and clear economic incentive, the answer is reproductive biology. Female elephants don't reach sexual maturity until their teens. Gestation runs close to 22 months, the longest of any land mammal. A calf then stays dependent on its mother for several more years. For any society trying to generate labor at scale, moving stone, hauling timber, fielding war elephants, breeding in captivity simply didn't pencil out. The generational turnover was too slow and the success rate too low to ever produce a self-sustaining population. Capturing and training an adult wild elephant, by contrast, took months. So that's what every culture did, independently in the Indus Valley, in Sri Lanka, across the kingdoms of Southeast Asia. Each region developed its own capture methods, driving wild herds into stockades, using trained elephants to subdue and restrain newly caught individuals, building trapping pits. None of these systems ever became closed-loop breeding operations. They were all extraction systems, dependent on a continuous supply of wild-caught animals, generation after generation. When European colonial powers expanded the timber industry in Southeast Asia, they didn't introduce a new model. They scaled up an existing one, industrializing wild capture to meet demand for logging labor in terrain where machinery couldn't operate. This forces a redefinition of what domestication actually means. The conventional model treats it as a threshold. A population crosses over, and from that point, its genome diverges from its wild ancestors under human-driven selection. Elephants never crossed that threshold. They were captured, trained, traded, and deployed across economies and militaries for thousands of years, while remaining, at the genomic level, fully wild populations. There's a second layer to this data that's worth covering. Genetic studies also picked up relatedness patterns that don't track with geography. Elephants in one region showing genetic ties to populations, hundreds of kilometers away with no natural migration route connecting them. The explanation is historical, not biological. Elephants were moved long distances as diplomatic gifts between rulers, as war spoils, and as trade commodities for royal courts. Those movements are now traceable as a layer of genetic signal embedded in regional populations, essentially a record of political history written into the genome. Several empires also attempted dedicated breeding programs specifically to produce war elephants without relying on capture. Historical records describe these as significant undertakings backed by royal resources. Nearly all of them failed to become self-sustaining. For the same reason, every other attempt failed. The reproductive timeline of the species didn't bend to institutional ambition, regardless of how much was invested. One more point, and this one extends past human history entirely. Comparative genomic work on living elephants and extinct relatives, including mammoths and other proboscideans, shows extensive interbreeding between lineages that were previously treated as cleanly separate species. The idea of a pure elephant lineage isn't supported by the data. The genomic picture is one of repeated hybridization stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, long before any human involvement. Put the timeline in perspective. Elephants existed in essentially their current genetic form for hundreds of thousands of years before the first Indus Valley seal was carved. 4,000 years of human use, relative to that timescale, left no detectable genetic imprint at all. This has a direct modern consequence. Current estimates put wild Asian elephant populations at roughly 40,000 to 50,000, with an additional 15,000 or so living in captivity, close to a third of the entire species under human management. But because no domestic breeding population was ever established, and because wild capture is now banned or heavily restricted across most range countries, that captive population is aging with no internal genetic pipeline to sustain it. The system that supplied captive elephants for 4,000 years has effectively shut down, and nothing replaced it. The core finding holds across every dataset examined. The most heavily utilized large mammal in human history was never, at any point, genetically altered by that use. It remains exactly what it was before any of it started. If this kind of genome-level rewrite of accepted history interests you, there's more of it. Subscribe, and I'll keep covering it.